You can access it later. And in just a minute or two, we will get started. We're just filling the room now. So we'll give it about one more minute. Okay. I know that people are still entering the room. My name is Scotland Nash. I'm the Education Director for the ADL Pacific Northwest region. We serve Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. So welcome to our conversation today. I'm actually going to introduce Andrea Copain, who is going to start our program for us. Andrea?
Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As Scotty said, I'm Andrea Copain, the CEO of Bird Bar Place, a historically Black organization and social service agency in the Central District of Seattle. And I'm deeply grateful for ADL's Pacific Northwest office, the League of Education Voters, UW College of Education, and all of the other ADL partners for their support of today's conversation. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and recognize our Native people of this land, both past and present. Those who were the original stewards of this land back before colonization. And I give my respect for the enduring relationship between all Indigenous people and their traditional territories, for the practices and spiritualities that are tied to this land on which we work and live. I acknowledge their suffering, the land theft, and genocide. And I honor with gratitude this land itself and the people who it ultimately belongs to. As the CEO of Bird Bar Place, which is, I consider, an interdisciplinary organization that, for many of you know, provides basic safety net services to anyone living at or below the poverty line. We have a food bank, utility assistance, rental assistance, education, financial education, but then also our community engagement arm. And our community engagement arm, we specifically look at gathering data at native-born Black Washingtonians. We want to understand and bench science how the needle is moving forward or backwards for our community. And one of those pillars that we began to study many years ago was education. And we looked at how our Black students were not starting third grade ready to read. We looked at our Black students not graduating high school on time. And even when we graduated from high school, we're not prepared for college or any type of higher education. And even as a mother today, I have a 5-year-old Black boy who will soon be entering the school system. And as well as I serve as co-chair of the Our Best program, a Black male achievement program in partnership with the City of Seattle and Seattle Public Schools. And so this topic is really ripe for me today. The big question today is why education? And why racial equity for Black students? I was taught that education provides us with knowledge of the world and tools around us. Knowledge and tools that we use to change our world for the better. Education is also a means to economic opportunity and ultimate liberation. And as I see it, on the horizon for humanity is possibly another pandemic like COVID-19, but also climate change and deepening inequality. And if we're going to fully fortify ourselves as a community and nation to face that future, we've got to address this education problem. Education of Black people and for Black people has been a tenuous topic in the United States. We know that educational outcomes for Black people and people of color are much more a function of our unequal access to key resources, including skilled teachers, quality curriculums, and class sizes, etc. We've seen various data points that show the US educational system is one of the most unequal in the industrialized world. And our students, based on race and socioeconomic status, receive dramatically different educational opportunities. And we need to transform our system to support learning opportunities that are central and equal for all. In essence, equal educational opportunity. So today, we're going to hear about the experiences and hopes of Manal, Keisha, and Mia in a discussion where we'll take a closer look at Seattle Public Schools' journey to achieve equity and access through their initiative to support African American males. We will learn about the challenges public school systems are facing and how they're preparing for the future, and what we can do to support students across the region as a community, as advocates, and educators. I will now hand it over to Scotty Nash, who will moderate today's discussion. Scotty?
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for such a thoughtful introduction. I want to also thank the League of Education Voters, the University of Washington College of Education, the Education Communities and Organizations Program specifically, and the Bird Bar Place for sponsoring this event. Please note that this is a different kind of format today. We're going to be in conversation, kind of like a vodcast, a video podcast, or a fireside chat. And you can post questions during the chat that we will hopefully get to at the end. The ADL has a mission to stop the defamation of Jewish people and to secure just and fair treatment for all. In my role as Director of Education for the Pacific Northwest region, I support schools and communities on implementing our No Place for Hate School Climate Initiative and our World of Difference anti-bias programming for staff, students, and community. I reached out to Keisha and Mia and Manal because I see these women as amazing, passionate, powerful Black women who were my colleagues when I was in Seattle Public Schools a number of years ago, and I believe that we can learn from their stories and their work. I see myself personally as an ally and an upstander to the Black community, and therefore part of what is driving me to surface this conversation is to support all of us in building empathy and understanding across difference. I can better support people who are placed, my hope for today's conversation is to increase our understanding about systemic racism in our schools so that we can all better support people who are often placed at an institutional disadvantage. As Dina Simmons, an educator, author, speaker, and researcher so clearly states, our education system was founded on practices that once excluded Black people from attending school and from sitting in the same classroom as white students. To overcome this history of exclusion, we must acknowledge it and then commit to eradicating not only the racist remnants, but also its present manifestations. For some, this conversation may be difficult, but it is essential. I ask those of you who are listening to this conversation to take time to share and process what you hear today and think about your own personal next steps in impacting and supporting this essential change. With that, I want to thank all of you for being here and listening to this conversation today. And I want to start by thanking each of the participants who are attending today. And I'm just going to launch with the question of, how are you doing right now? As leaders, educators, and Black women, we've got COVID in the understory of what's happening in our systems today, and you're leading such significant and important work. So I'm going to ask each of you to just start by sharing, how are you? And to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing. And I'm going to start with Keisha, and then we can move to Mia and Manal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Scotty, and Andrea. Thank you so much for that great opening as well. So, gosh, that is just such a loaded question, I think, in some ways about how are we doing. In some sense, I feel hopeful about the crisis energy right now happening nationally and in our country. What's being called a racial reckoning. So that stands out to some level of hopefulness. I'm hopeful about some possible political outcomes coming up. So that gives me hope, and and it's really incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard for my family, my extended family that have been impacted by COVID-19 right now. It's incredibly hard to work in school systems there's just so much need, and then also knowing that none of this is new, that this is the latest manifestation of an ongoing pandemic with a highlight around COVID-19, but really racism is standing out for me right now. So yeah, it's just an incredibly hard time, and I have to freedom dream, like Dr. Bettina Love says. So I have to sort of radically reimagine our systems and how they interact in our education system as well. And that's what keeps me feeling like I can move forward with all the things that we're sort of balancing. And so just to give a brief introduction about myself, Dr. Keisha Scarlett, I'm Chief of Equity Partnerships and Engagement in Seattle Public Schools. I've been a lifelong member, maybe, of Seattle Public Schools. I attended SPS for my K-12 education, and then have worked the past 21 years in the school system as an educator, and now I'm in central office as well as a school leader and central office leader. Right now I oversee our Department of Racial Equity Advancement, our school and community partnerships, and also our stakeholder engagement, which is family and community engagement, and work really closely with Dr. Williams in the Office of African American Male Achievement as well. She'll talk more about the work that she's doing. So I'm really glad to be here with you all, and glad to just be able to be on this dynamic panel with people that I just respect so much, who are just such great sisters and partners in this work.
Thank you, Keisha. It's good to see you. Mia, would you tell us, how are you, and tell us a little bit about your journey and your job now?
Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. As Keisha said, that's such a hard question, and it brings up so much emotions thinking about every time the racial trauma that you feel and that we carry within our being has always been something that is very challenging. And in some ways I'm numb, and I feel, because of the experiences have happened so over and over, and it's every day, that you become a little bit numb and compartmentalizing, and just remembering to keep the armor. And so I retreat, and I have to just, but I'm hopeful and I'm blessed for all the things that I have as a job, place to live. I have a wonderful family and friends, and that I get the wonderful opportunity to get to be a part of something that is transformative for the future. So definitely am hopeful, but it is a weight that feels, it is a weight because I want to make sure that all of our kings and queens get the best educational experience that they deserve every day. So carrying that as well in the midst of all of, like, as we mentioned, the multiple pandemics, but it definitely is, it is very complex in that space. So I am Dr. Mia Williams, and I am the proud chief of the Office of African American Male Achievement, which was founded last August 2019. And I'm starting my 27th year in Seattle Public Schools, as I was a teacher, an assistant principal for many years, and then most recently, the proud principal of Aki Kurosi Middle School in Southeast Seattle, and now of the Office of African American Male Achievement, which is reconstructing Seattle Public Schools' educational environment to support the brilliance and excellence of Black boys and teens. AMA is not a program, but a driver of systemic change. AMA exists to transform the school system to serve the unique needs of Black boys and teens, dismantle the systemic racism and education ecosystem, and liberate all students of color from systemic oppression. And that's a lot. And as I said, that my hopes and dreams in carrying that for the future of liberation for our babies, I am super excited to get to be a part of this work with some wonderful colleagues as yourself, as well as Manal and Keisha and Andrea.
Thank you so much, Mia, for sharing that. We're going to unpack all of that in just a few minutes, but I'd love to touch base with Manal. How are you today, Manal? And can you tell us a little bit about your story, how you tell us about your position, how you're doing, and some of the work you've got going on in Seattle?
Yeah, so I'm the director of the Department of Racial Equity Advancement and newly the Ethnic Studies program at Seattle Public Schools. I'm from Seattle. I was born in Ethiopia, raised in Seattle. Seattle is home. I have a background in community organizing and also organizing within institutions for racial equity advancement. I've done that as an educator. I've done that as a strategic advisor at the city, as an attorney for various organizations and institutions across the US. And I've always been pushing for Black education and Black liberation in my work. Now I'm positioned to do something in partnership with the women on this call, as well as the greater Seattle Public Schools community that is investing and pouring into systems change, anti-racist systems change. And what that kind of entails, I'll just give you a bit of it because it'll take up this call if I really get into it. But it's leading and institutionalizing racial equity teams across central office and across schools. And these racial equity teams develop their capacity and that of their colleagues, as well as the capacity, knowledge, skill set of their students. So in collaboration, these teams can organize to build an anti-racist system and also ensure racial equity within the system we currently have. So that's one bit. And I said more recently, I am co-leading, I'm the director for the Ethnic Studies program, but it's in partnership with the Curriculum Instruction Division. And we're pushing to ensure that we develop a pro-Black and pro-Indigenous ethnic studies program that's interdisciplinary across all subject areas, and that we foster and develop a Black education program that's community-centered and community-led. So I am doing well. I go between feeling extremely nervous and extremely powerful, but a lot of that is because of the women that are around me and working with Dr. Williams and Dr. Scarlett, to pick you up when you feel low and, and stand in power with you when you feel powerful. So that's how I'm doing today.
Thank you, Manal. So the question might be, why are we, the ADL, partnering in lifting this conversation? And we want to acknowledge that the public education system was established to educate the boys of wealthy white men, and it hasn't changed a whole lot since its initial establishment. And while there has been some success in the system in the last couple hundred years, it's time for change. There's no question there. And what really encouraged me to reach out to the three of you was that it seems to be a pretty radical shift in a district to say we are going to drive systemic change through the Department of African American Male Achievement. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities of trying to lead change with such a focused effort that is going to impact everybody in the system? So any of you can start, but I would love to just hear a little bit from you in terms of those challenges and the opportunities and why this groundbreaking systemic change and drive is the path forward.
I can start because I got the opportunity to work with our community stakeholders on actually drafting the strategic plan that we have, the Seattle Excellence Strategic Plan. That's really a driver for the work that we're taking up around improving outcomes for our students furthest from educational justice, with a particular focus on African American boys and young teens. And one of the things that we were able to really make some considerations is how do we activate a theoretical frame around targeted universalism, where we make sure that how do we make considerations about those people, those students who have been marginalized and sit on the margins of the system, and then move them into the center of discussion. And so when I say it's a theoretical frame, it is because the actual application of that is no joke. It takes everyone consistently interrupting their privilege, interrupting inequality and inequity in order to reframe discussions like that. Our white supremacy norms or white cultural norms are about more individualism versus collectivism. It's about sort of maybe trusting your own gut and moving in those type of ways. And so the cultural shifts that need to happen in order for us to be able to lead in these ways, I think are really substantial as well. And so as Seattle Public Schools, we've been doing targeted work on on racial equity moving forward. A lot of conversation about racial equity, but how do you actually lead for racial equity? And how do you actually enact anti-racism as a lever for advancing racial equity? And then I have sort of this new energy, or really pinpoint what this energy needs to happen and for it to happen. And I'll let Manal maybe speak a little bit more about that, about what does it mean for a system to actually build, promote, and enact a pro-Black agenda as a system. And so what does that look like for everyone in the system to be able to move and drive that forward? So just a high level coordination. One of the things that I think ends up happening with me being like the chief of equity, everyone wants to give us all of the work to do. So anything that is about racialized people or has to do with their families, they're like, Manal, Keisha, Mia, please, and like kind of moving into that. So one of our big roles in the system is to ensure that we have mechanisms that we're showing up, in space to sort of scrutinize the greater system, but also we're champions for our children and our families as well. And so us being champions doesn't mean that we're sitting there doing all of the work and that we're responsible for everything. It's really empowering other folks in the system to think differently, and how do they have a racial equity mindset as they're making decisions as well. So I'll pause there. I know the other ladies have some things to say about that.
Thanks, Keisha. That helps a lot in terms too of shifting it from the role of a person. And I know, Mia, when we talked earlier, I really appreciated the lens in which you provided. So I'd love to hear from you too, in terms of, this isn't the job of Keisha and Mia and Manal, but this is the job of the system. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yes, and I think that that's so important to say that, like, our office, and I like to call it office, not a department, because people, like, they put in silos of things, and like I'd like to say, this is everyone's work. It's Seattle Public Schools, it's the community, it's the families, all of us to wrap our arms around this work. And so it's really important to being very clear that we are a driver of systemic change, and really working together to build the coherence that needs to happen to really support the educational system and conditions that our Black boys and teens need to thrive in the system. And so we are really committed of focusing on that by our foundational strategies. And first, but I'd like to back up a little bit, is that being mindful that this is a marathon and definitely not a sprint. Not discounting the sense of urgency, but to do transformative work, it needs to be a marathon. And we think about, when we're getting prepared for a marathon, we need to practice, build, and cover things and get ready for that marathon, so that it is systemic and it's institutionalized in the right way of being a pro-Black, anti-racist organization. So in that regard, we have 4 foundational strategies of the Office of African American Male Achievement. And the first, we call them the 4 C's. And the first one is really creating the right culture within every educational environment within our system. And what does it look like? How are we affirming our Black boys and teens? How are we building rituals, systems? What does that look like in every space? Then we move to, what are the right conditions that need to be in place? So what are the policies that are creating access, or not, or creating barriers? And how do we dismantle the ones that are creating barriers for our Black boys and students? And the next C is the competencies. What are the competencies of the adults all around us that need to help in our commitment to becoming an anti-racist organization? What needs to be in place in being culturally responsive, as well as making sure that we have a diverse workforce by having representation that looks like our students, as our Black males would love to see, as we hear in our different settings, that they would love to see someone that looks like them in front of them. So our work is around that. And then our last, but definitely not least, is our community connections. how are we all wrapping our arms around our Black boys and teens and really making sure, no matter what your zip code is in Seattle Public Schools, that you are going to get the best educational experience that you deserve. And really, we have phenomenal Black-led organizations within our city that have been doing phenomenal work for a long time. We're really coming together to elevate our teens. And I think the last thing, so those are the foundational things, and as we go, I don't want to make sure I give Manal time to speak. I would like to talk about some of the things that we've been able to do. And so I saw someone say, can I repeat? So culture, the conditions, the competencies of the staff and educators within Seattle Public Schools, and the diversity of teachers, specifically for our office of Black male teachers and leaders. And the last C is community connections. And so I just think that it's important, but our work is centered. One thing that I would also like to say is that our Black boys and teens have said repeatedly is that our society and Seattle Public Schools has really been trying to reform schools without centering their voices. And our biggest thing is to make sure they're like, you talk to our parents, you talk to the community, but what about us? And we're the ones experiencing the education every day. So how do we push on that as we are being a driver of transformation for the system?
Thank you, Mia. So Manal, they keep turning to you to talk a little bit more about the pro-Black agenda. And I would love to hear your perspective on that in terms of sharing its broader impact on the entire Seattle Public Schools community. And then I'm going to follow up with another question to the three of you. Yeah,
absolutely. I do want to also touch on the question around why racial equity and what it is that we're doing.
Please.
So, because I get that question quite a bit, and you know, Dr. Williams is really conscious in many spaces about identifying deficit language and these narratives around something being wrong with these students. So we're all trying to help these students, and the way that the data points and disparities are read often reinforce this like deficit narrative, when in reality, why we're in this district, or you know, why I believe my department is so important to the district, is because the school district is charged with educating all students. We serve a diverse population of students. So what it is that we're actually doing, sorry, I got an alert on my screen and it's blocking all of you. So yeah, as I was saying, what we're actually doing is helping the district build all students into global scholars and citizens. That's actually what we're doing. The system is failing Black, Indigenous, and Brown students because it was built on institutional racism and racist values. So the district is, and all districts that I know of, have this legacy of racism, ongoing institutionalized personal and structural racism that exists within these districts. So they bring folks like us to come in and strategize both how to advocate and not recenter, but center finally Black, Indigenous, and Brown students in this system, so we can achieve racial equity within the system. And also, how can we deconstruct the system and build a system that does not function to marginalize these Black, Indigenous, and Brown students? So that's actually what we're doing. So when I mentioned the racial equity teams, for example, earlier, a piece of that is to develop the content knowledge, is the knowledge base, and the skill set among our staff and our students to organize and change these systems, because Black, Indigenous, and Brown students have not been valued or centered historically in education. Folks coming into education, educational leadership or educational teaching programs and administrative leadership programs, the curriculum that they're certified in often also does not center Black, Indigenous, and Brown students. So it creates it continues this these conditions, you know, to Dr. Williams' point, these lack of community connections, this curriculum that marginalizes the experiences and the values and important information for these Black, Indigenous, and Brown students, which just perpetuate these issues. So that's actually what we're doing here. We're trying to help the district achieve what it is charged with doing, which is building and developing these children into educated, thriving global scholars. I would also like to say, in terms of the pushing for pro-Blackness, in practice, what a lot of people fall into doing, particularly when they are not pro-Black, and that goes for Black, Indigenous, POC, people of color, and white people in the institution. If they are not at a place where they can love and appreciate someone or a community in their Blackness, they often practice racial equity in a way that leaves out Black people. They practice anti-racism in a way that is hoping to achieve this post-racial society, hoping to achieve a point where the system is no longer harming people based on race, and race is no longer an indicator for outcomes, but we also don't want to see your race elevated any further than that. So what we're talking about around pro-Blackness is achieving that anti-racist system where folks are not being harmed, but also protecting Black folks in particular, who even among these racial equity, anti-racist, or BIPOC movements continue to be marginalized, can celebrate themselves, can appreciate themselves, can decolonize their minds and cultures in the way that they see fit, without punishment, without negative consequence, without marginalization. So that's what Dr. Scarlett was referring to, and just a few points on why we need to lead racial equity.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more broad question and then share some questions from the group as well. At times, some people might feel like they're being left out of the conversation and left out of this movement and this systemic change. How do we address that concern? How do you talk about how the work supports every student, and more specifically, how does this work support those who are furthest away from the opportunity? This might include policies, this might include practices, this might include, so just how does your work begin to address and support those who are furthest away from opportunity? And go back to the conversation about how do you address those people who are concerned that maybe they're being left out of the conversation? And this is to all of you.
I'll name the targeted universalism strategy that's being used at the district. So one strategy that we've implemented is centering those furthest from educational justice. And being unapologetic about centering them to achieve this point of educational justice and developing this anti-racist system. For folks that feel left out in that process, I think there's just an education piece. Sometimes folks don't understand that maybe some of the historical ideals that are pushed out to particularly BIPOC communities in hopes of pitting communities against each other, or scaring white communities into falling out of support for racial equity initiatives, kind of deconstructing those ideas and those messages that have historically plagued our inter-community relationships and interracial relationships. So that would be one strategy.
I would like to add that, well, for us, we're in multiple phases of the work. I think about centering all the voices, but I would say when we're talking about targeted universalism, that there is a Stanford study that talks about the Office of African American Male Achievement, which started 11 years ago in Oakland, the first office. And we are definitely in partnership with Kingmakers of Oakland, but one of the things that they did a study there, and it showed that all students benefited by having the supports around Black males. And I think that that's important to recognize that their outcomes achieved, because when you make the best policies that are creating access for everyone, then the students are going to be able to have more access. When you create a safe and welcoming environment for each individual, that is going to allow students to feel more safe and ready to want to engage in school in those spaces. But within our department, we have different phases, and we have a mantra that we talk about, that we are going to listen, and then we're going to act, and then we're going to repeat. And one of the things that we need to talk about is like not just listening now, we need to consistently be listening and acting, and then continuing that. So our big thing is that we have 3 phases, and we still are in phase 1. But there's some crossover into phase 2 and 3. And what I mean by that is our first one is we also believe that nothing about us without us, and really not building a system that is not based off of what the community and each person's adding. And like I said, centering African American voice. So that by that we've been doing site visits, we've been to community meetings, we're going to be shadowing into online classes. And we have a listening and learning campaign. So right now our goal is to really engage with at least a minimum of 500 Black boys and teens within our system to really hear about their experiences. And it's based around the 4 C's. We will be soon, so look for soon, that we will be having a Black male families and community meeting by regions, which will also focus on hearing feedback from the communities. As I saw someone asked about, what about North Seattle? What about all different places? And so we do understand that there's different experiences in different spaces. And so we want to make sure that all those voices are heard, and that we will in January, hopefully towards the end of January, we're looking for the trends. We'll triangulate that to make a multi-year plan, but we'll share out with the community as well as all of Seattle Public Schools about what we heard directly from our African American males and the community on when we were really building that. Because again, I could have walked in today and said, we're going to do all the things that I think what's best. and that is not the case. So we need to build it with our community and centering that. So we're in that phase. And so our hope is, but what we know is the research also shows that when there's Black male educators or diverse staff, all students benefit from that as well. So we want all of our students to be able to see themselves, but we are centering Black males, as we know that the system has oppressed all of the Black and brown students, and our job is to transform that to liberation.
Thank you, Mia. Keisha, did you have anything you wanted to add to this idea? I know you've been doing the work for a while as well, and would love to hear from you.
Well, I mean, you brought up about policy, and it was making me think about the work that we do in policy, that we believe that having strong policy for ensuring racial equity and anti-racist in practice is absolutely essential for systems. And it is an actual institutional belonging structure when we have policy in place. And so the policy that we have in place, I think, is beginning to shift and evolve. We've had a ensuring educational and racial equity policy in place for the last 8 years. And right now are in the process of working and building out a anti-racism policy, a pro-Black, pro-Indigenous, anti-racist racism policy for Seattle Public Schools. And so just our sort of policy arc or evolution over time and what we've learned in the field, that the language is changing always. I think it's really important. And a couple of big ideas I think that we're learning in policy is that we have a lot of policy that's focused on students, which is really important because that's the work that we do. And we need to make sure that we have anti-racist policy that is inclusive of families and communities who are working, who are part in coordinating and working with us and partnering us with the school district, but also adults of color who work in the system. Adults, particularly those who are leading racial justice work, like Manal, Mia, and myself, need to have some protections around that. I think that there are some really important aspects as we talk about a pro-Black and pro-Indigenous policy, that we think about what is the drive for Indigenous people around sovereignty and civil rights and self-determination. And then sort of the unique tie that binds the stolen bodies of Africans who were brought here as enslaved, and then the stolen lands, and how white supremacy manifested in ways of colonizing the body, the mind, and trying to colonize the spirit of Black and Indigenous people. And so that solidarity is very important as we think about how we move past racism, how do we shift racist systems and move toward anti-racism. So that stands out really well for me. And so I guess even to the point that Dr. Williams spoke about having Black male teachers or diverse staff, we have inhospitable environments that are for their children as much as they are for adults. They're inhospitable, which creates a leaky pipeline despite our best intentions on recruiting people of color to come and be staff and leaders and work in central office. They're met with so much institutional racism that it makes them want to leave the organization. And so how do we pay attention to the environment that creates support and connection and really highlights the brilliance of the adults that we're bringing in the system as well. At the same time, Dr. Williams always says that adults are just grown-up versions of children. And so every single thing that our students have encountered, adults of color have encountered and have, had different skills to help transcend different environments, and really, tried to move forward and to really lean into the brilliance that they have in order to be able to even get to the point where you're even able to work in a school system. But we cannot lose sort of focus sight on that. And so, there right now in our district, there's some organizing from some other folks in community just around really a focused anti-racism policy for students, but they're not systems leaders, and they don't really understand all of the sort of points of feedback that come in the system. What is remarkable about school systems is that they are there's such a replication of each other all across the country that I can have a conversation with a teacher in Milwaukee, a Black teacher in Milwaukee, our teacher color in Milwaukee, one in Boston, one maybe in a rural town, one in Houston, one in Los Angeles, and one in Seattle. And each one of them are having the same conversations about how they're navigating with their white counterparts, about how their intelligence is being questioned all the time, about their value for the field, the lack of mentorship, the lack of sponsorship. There's just so many, there are just myriad sort of experiences that adults of color in systems are having. And so you imagine that they have like proximity to understanding systems, and that's made even worse for our families who don't have maybe the proximity to being able to navigate and really understand and have all sort of the rules of navigation. And then how does that translate for our students also? So this is a multifaceted, multi-level issue that we're dealing with in the system as well. And we're working on that as well with like our human resources department, and what does it look like with our hiring practices and retention practices as well.
So a couple questions have come through in the questions in the chat, highlighting to ask the question of how are the students' voices being elevated and what are you hearing from them? So Mia talked a little bit about the listening tours and Manal talked a little bit about equity groups, but I would love to hear a little bit more. I think actually a bunch of people mentioned, how are we hearing from students and what are the trends and what are they saying at this point?
So one of the ways that we're committed to making sure that we're elevating our we refer to our Black boys and teens as Kings Voices, is that we launched the office, we launched the African American Male Student Leadership Council. And what they have been so busy, of course, which is great, because not only to get them to have a voice at the table, they have been decision makers. And what that looks like is that they've been sitting on different, like the opening school task force. They've been a part of the grading task force or work groups. They are sitting alongside of us in a lot of crucial places. And one of the quotes that we heard from the Kings in our council has said that, you know, he was a senior last year, and he said, for this, after 13 years, this is the first time anybody's listened to me about education and where I felt like my voice is valued. So as we will be adding additional, and currently our council goes from 7th grade through 12th grade, and our hope is to have representation from each of the middle schools and high schools throughout the system. With COVID, our numbers, we weren't able to make that happen, but we're hoping soon we're going to be adding more from every school, because we want to make sure that their voices are heard, but also be able to be within their school communities and have their voices heard by leading staff and community opportunities to elevate student voices there is one way that we are doing that, elevating. And we also are currently doing focus groups. So we are moving all over the city. The managers, Adam and Kevin of the Office of AMA, have 5 to 8 Black boys and teens on calls, and that we have set questions, but it's them speaking their truth. And our hope is to share all that out. But I know people said, is there anything shocking? What I will say is that it's heart-wrenching to hear the dehumanization that they've experienced, but it is hopeful about them with their solutions to help them thrive in our system. And again, they've been the absent voice. And so know that, yeah, there's not a lot of shock, just as being a Black woman moving through the educational system, but definitely very hopeful. And we're committed to making sure that their voices are at the center of the multi-year plan to make sure that they thrive. So stay tuned, but it's from everything from mental health supports, it's from the teachers in front of them, in which I always believe the best gift that we can give any student is to have the best educators in front of them with their experience. And to add on to the last piece that Keisha discussed was that we were asked a question, and this is such a complex way, is that as we are calling out the racist practices as we sit on different work groups or throughout, but as adults, a parent asked the question of how do we call out those racist practices that are happening for their babies every day in schools, but then also support the adults that are in front of them. And so that is really the piece. And as Dr. Scott talked about, it's supporting the BIPOC educators, as well as really talking about how do we keep them. And so it's not even enough to just, recruit and hire, but the retention is something huge that has to be there so that we have that. But really, how do we do both of those? Call it out, but also push their practice to get better and to give our babies the education they deserve.
So all of you are leading really important pieces of this process and the systemic change. Is organizations, both community organizations and other educators are listening, what would be a recommendation around a first step? Like, how do you get started in this work as you think about needing to partner, to collaborate, or as you think about systems that might be standing alone and not connected to Seattle? So really thinking about a first step, either for a community organization and or for schools and districts who are beginning to think about this work.
Manal, do you want to answer that one first?
The first step ran on really long in my head, so I was trying to to cut it down. So I'm just gonna speak on it. It's gonna sound like a long couple steps, I guess, but as a first step, I would educate myself and be conscious of who I was receiving that education from, who are the authors of the books that you're reading, who is the teacher, whether in community or in an institution, what are their qualifications for telling you about Black, Indigenous, Brown history here. A lot of the stuff that we described, if you do look back to even enslavement of Black African people in the United States, it isn't structured all that differently. The barriers in education in every racist system are around power, autonomy, ownership, capital. That's always been what Black, Indigenous, people of color have been distanced from, I should say. So information leads to those things. Information leads to power, autonomy, capital, ownership. And if we look back, whether it was during enslavement, post-enslavement, during the Jim Crow era, pushing on to today, if you see where the information gaps occur, they are around these areas. One thing from to reinforce what Dr. Williams was saying, that could also be a good step on top of educating yourself, would be centering those most impacted by institutionalized racism. Who are you serving in this context? It's students and families that are furthest from educational justice and most impacted by institutionalized racism. And by centering them, it means, as Dr. Williams described, creating systems, being conscious about your systems of decision making and ensuring that they are positioned and look towards the same way there are hierarchical structures, position them to eliminate that that hierarchy, that positionality, so they're making the decisions around a certain area or just topic or something that's going to impact them. And then also just in space, eliminate positionality. There have been times where we've held panels like this and at the Liberation Through Anti-Racist Education Institute, and we eliminated positionality by having directors, parents, students all answer the same question, all positioned similarly. No one's voice mattered more than anyone else's. And information from that panel that happened to be around Black studies in particular was then taken, analyzed, and embedded directly into the pro-Black and pro-Indigenous anti-racist policy, with no one comment meaning more than another. So I guess as a first step, I would say, A, educate yourself. B, analyze like the systems you have in place to center those most impacted by institutionalized racism, and even in space, community, and conversation, I would say make sure that you're eliminating positionality.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes, and I just want to share, a lot of people ask for book recommendations, so I'm going to be following up with each of the three of you for a book recommendation that we can send out with the recording of this session. I want to highlight some of the things that I heard from each of you in terms of this idea of centering voice, looking inward, really listening to the children, the educators, the people who are being most impacted by the systemic racism that we have in our system. And so by looking inward and by listening to others, all three of you are creating those opportunities. And I think that's so amazing. And so incredible that we are working on this. In terms of sharing books and perhaps articles or something that you've read, in closing, I would love to hear from each of you who has been the most impactful person in getting you to the place where you are now. So who has helped? Is it a person? Is it an author? Is it a mentor? But who has really helped to bring you to where you are now? And take this opportunity to highlight them in this work as well. And then I'll bring us to close. And Manal, I think that you're still on, so I'm going to ask you to go first.
Yeah, full transparency. The main person that came to mind was my mother, to be honest with you. She's the person who always told me to trust what my experience was, and not to second guess what I was perceiving, and that I, throughout my life, since I was a youth until adulthood, that I have the solutions for myself and for my community. And that's influenced the way that I engage with community, family, students, educators of color. I trust their experience and I trust their leadership because she trusted mine.
Thank you, Manal.
I was going to say my father also, because he just didn't, both of my parents didn't hide, or they narrated the experiences that they had and helped us to develop language to understand the experiences. I also had an opportunity to attend an HBCU, a historically Black college and university. And so that is likely where I was politicized. And I can remember doing a deep study into W.E. Du Bois that we, credit with a whole lot of things, but he's the father of sociology, and his work in Philadelphia of the ethnographic work of living in the Philadelphia community and creating a counter story against these deficit mindsets about things being wrong with Black people was probably the place that I can really remember digging really deeply into this and being able to be maybe more introspective and have a deeper level of analysis about what was happening, what it was happening presently for myself when I was in college in the 90s. But I keep going back to his work as well within that, because it's work that's not highlighted, but definitely I think essential work in reframing counter narrative and counter stories about Black people in America.
Thank you, Keisha. Mia?
Well, of course, my mom is, as she has passed on, but is probably the biggest champion, as everybody already talked about. But what I would say it really most impactful, I'm going to just as a student center leader, that I would say students and all the students over the 27 years have really built me into the leader that I am today. And because there's no silver bullet to anything, relationships matter, and really making sure that the students are seen, heard, and that we act to really perpetuate their liberation. So over the years and every day, and as I was thinking about, the biggest thing that I miss is being able to walk down the hall and engage or see them in class learning. I'm really building who I am. So make sure that people our babies are seen, heard, and act appropriately to help them thrive. So they are probably my biggest teachers.
Thank you so much. I really took a lot away from this conversation. I love talking to you at other times. I love sharing this conversation with others, and just really want to reinforce the idea of the fact that all three of you mentioned relationships with your families. So if you have family, to think about this conversation and think about how to carry it forward. Think about those people that you connect with and how to share what you heard and how to ask meaningful questions. We'll get some reading recommendations from our panelists here. Really appreciate hearing from them, and I'm sure we'd love to know a little bit more about what they read in terms of books or articles. And I just want to thank you for attending, and I want to thank you for participating. So with that, have a wonderful afternoon. It is 1 o'clock, and I want to just say thank you for coming today.
Thank you.